Okay, it was a big deal, but anyway. Now, because their women often had 8 or 9 children, the population boomed. But the younger generation that was born oftentimes did not have the religious zeal of their parents. Now, I can tell you from experience, I've seen this. When one generation is religiously indifferent, the next generation will be religiously all fired up and enthused. Or you get parents who are religiously fired up, their children will oftentimes be indifferent. This is just the way things are. These things go back and forth from one generation to another. The New Englanders did not realize this, but anyway, now there was another group of people whom we'll talk more about in another chapter, but I'm about to mention them here, the Quakers. Talk about enthused. These people were very, very enthused about their religion. They got the name Quakers because they would worship so fervently that they would actually shake. Similar, you might say, to what Pentecostals do today, except we don't have any record they spoke in tongues. But they were very, very committed to religion. But they would not serve in the army. They would not swear oaths. They used the language of the King James Bible, thee and thou. They would not address anyone as your majesty or sir or lord, but always as friend. Now, there's a story that William Penn, who became a Quaker, but he was a close friend of the king. He went to visit the king one time on the king's invitation. So he sat in the same room with the king, but William Penn was supposed to take his hat off in the presence of the king. He wouldn't. Kept his hat on. The king took his crown off. And William Penn said, "Friend," he was supposed to address him as your majesty, but he said, "Friend, why dost thou remove thy crown?" And the king said, "Well, it's customary when in the presence of a king only one person to have his head covered. But since you insist on keeping your head covered, I thought I'd keep the custom. I'd take my crown off so that my head would be uncovered and not yours." The king and William understood each other. The king began, this time the king had a tolerance. But the Quakers, though at first were persecuted, well, they came to New England where they were extremely persecuted. There, they thought they'd found religious freedom in New England. Instead, they found that things were worse than they had been in England. 4 of them, now another book I've read says 5, but at least 4 of them were hung. But at this time, all the other colonists rose up and asked Master, "Why did you hang these Quakers? What crime did they commit?" They were preaching on the streets. The King of England got involved. He wrote to the governor and asked the governor, "What reason do you have to kill these Quakers?" The governor said, "Oh, your majesty, this was done without my knowledge, but I promise you I've instructed my local sheriffs, it won't happen again." But they'd done it without the governor. Now today, before the government can execute anyone, it has to go through an appeals process. But these Puritans, again, they got a really bad name. Now, the thing that really, really finally did Puritanism in was the Salem witchcraft trials. 5 girls and a slave got together one time. All right, now, I'm going to give a little bit of background. I'm the father of 2 young girls. These girls in New England colony, Puritan girls, were not allowed to play with dolls because this looked on being a form of idolatry. They were not allowed to dress in brightly colored clothes. They were not allowed to sit around and tell stories. They were not allowed to make puppets and put on puppet shows. They were not allowed to do a whole lot of things that young girls like to do. And they had all this youthful energy pent up. And of course, there have been many a person who wonder why they did it, but they finally, this black slave girl would go visit the Indians, and some people believe that it's known that she influenced them, but she learned some witchcraft from the Indians and then went back and secretly taught it to these girls. Make a long story short, these girls finally began to pretend that they were under the spell of witches. Then they pointed an accusing finger at the men and women of the Salem colony, Salem village. Before it was over with, 20 people in Salem were hung. This became a super embarrassment to the Puritans later when it was found out these girls finally confessed. They faked it all. Of all these 5 girls, none of them ever married. They all 5 died in poverty. And they wound up they said that they could not give an explanation as to why they did it. And our psychologists today are still trying to figure out what would make them do anything like this. Nevertheless, this actually happened just yesterday. I heard our president refer to some people who are against him as a witch hunt. Again, harks back to the term witch hunt was used during Richard Nixon's administration, and it's used from time to time when people are going out trying to dig up dirt on somebody when it's hard to dig up dirt on them. This is called a witch hunt. This act did Puritanism in much more than about anything else. Eventually the king decided he was going to take over and run the colony himself, which he did. Now, in the meantime, though, leaving the religious part, what all did the people of New England do for a living? Well, they began fishing. There are three things: livestock, fishing, and timber. The tall New England pines were used to build ships, masts for the ships, and when the USS Constitution was built, the only trees we had in North America that would serve as masts were the tall New England pines. And anyway, they took to timber. The winters in New England are cold and long, and the snows can get deep. And when the snows melt, the mud can get every bit of 2 or 3 feet deep. And it's very difficult. So, well, they had a hard time getting their produce to market. And even their cattle and pigs and sheep and whatever had to do their own walking to market where they'd be slaughtered and sold, because they could not transport them with wagons. Walking was difficult enough, but wagons were impossible owing to the thick deepness of the mud that would be around when the snow melted. All right. Now, moving on from New England to New York, the Dutch settled in New York. Now, the Dutch are people from Holland. A man named Peter Minuit purchased some land from the Indians for what today we'd count a few dollars. It was a few furs he got and a few little trinkets and whatever, which he gave the Indians in exchange for what is today New York City. Today you couldn't even buy an inch of land for what he paid for in New York, what he paid for that. But nevertheless, Peter Minuit bought the land of New York from the Indians. The Dutch set up a colony there, but the Dutch colony was somewhat weak. The King of England gave his brother, the Duke of York, the land that the Duke of York had to go take it. So the Duke of York sent a navy of ships to New Amsterdam. Peter Minuit called the colony New Amsterdam after Amsterdam, Holland. But they went to New Amsterdam, and the Duke of York's navy took New Amsterdam from the Dutch and named it New York. Basically, he's naming it after himself because he was Duke of York. Now, in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania means Penn's Woods, a man named Penn. All right, well, there are two William Penns. There's William Penn the father and William Penn the son. William Penn the father was an admiral in the British Navy and very, very wealthy. And he was close friends to the king. And he loaned money to the king. William Penn had a son, also whom he named William. And William Penn, the son, started to follow in his father's footsteps until one day young William Penn converted to Quakerism. And the old admiral was really upset. He kicked his son out of the house for a few days, but then he couldn't sleep, couldn't think of anything else. His son finally went out searching for his son, found him and brought him back in with full inheritance rights. He had told him he was going to disown him, but he didn't. Full inheritance rights, and accepted the fact that his son was a Quaker. He might well make the most of it. And good thing he did, because the only reason we remember him today was because of his son. His son William inherited the money that the king owed, and it became obvious after a while that the king could not pay the debt. Now here's a story. You might say, couldn't the king levy taxes? No, in England. This king was Charles II. His father had tried to raise taxes without Parliament. His father had sent the Parliament home and raised taxes. the people of England cut Charles's first head off. So when Charles II got the throne years later, he knew he could not raise taxes, and without the tax money, he could not pay his debt either. So to pay the debt off, he gave William Penn a bunch to take the land west of the Susquehanna River. William did, he made it into a Quaker colony. However, he allowed religious freedom, and he tried to make peace with the Indians, and for the longest of time, during his lifetime, the colony of Pennsylvania had no Indian massacres. Now, I think I tried to make a point with this about that time, that when you're civilized and you're dealing with people who aren't civilized, the friendships you make with them will not likely last long. Eventually, the people of the Indians and living in Pennsylvania turned against the whites, and they began to encroach on them. Some Indian children were killed, and the Indians said, well, we have a right to take your children. They went in and stole a bunch of white children. The whites got up an army and drove most of the Indians out. Until today, there are very few Indians living in Pennsylvania. Again, I don't know how this kind of issue could have been avoided. A clash was inevitable, but in the short run, William Penn himself had peace, and for the longest time, Pennsylvania did not experience an Indian massacre. The colony became, for all practical purposes, a Quaker colony. I've got to digress a little bit here. We might know, maybe you don't, we've had two Quaker presidents, Herbert Hoover and Richard Nixon, by name, and each of you decide. But two Quaker presidents, and if you go to a supermarket, you might notice Quaker oats, again made by the Quakers. Or you might notice Quaker State Motor Oil if you go to any kind of a car shop. A high quality oil. Generally they're known for good quality products. To make a long story short, folk, the Quakers, some of them became wealthy, and when they got wealthy, they lost their religious zeal.
They lost. What'd you say? They lost.
When they became wealthy, they lost most of their religious zeal. I mean, I grew up in I'm not going to call the name, what amounted to almost religious cult. But they were hard against smoking and drinking. I mean, you know, but when they went to the workplace, because they didn't smoke and didn't drink, they had better attendance records and less sickness among them than the people who did. And some of them got promotions in the workplace. When they got promotions, of course, that meant they had more money. They took their old cars and towed them off to a junkyard and bought better cars. They started dressing better. They started living in better houses, and a lot of their religious zeal went down the tubes also. I mean, it doesn't have to be that way, but in a lot of cases, that's the way it is. People who have a lot of wealth don't have as much zeal for religion as people who do.
Excuse me.
Yes?
The two presidents, what were their names again? Richard Nixon and who else?
What's that?
The two Quaker presidents?
Oh, you don't have that. Won't be on the test. I thought I'd throw them in. Their names were Herbert Hoover and Richard Nixon. Herbert Hoover was president from 1929 to 1933, and Richard Nixon from 1969 to 1974. Two Quakers. Some of the Quakers became wealthy. All right, now this is where we start beginning. I mean, okay, folk, I hope all of you are aware, before we came into class, that the United States fought a long war with Great Britain. I mean, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but hopefully most of you knew that already. If you didn't, you don't have to know that, I mean, because I'm going to teach it. But we fought a war with Great Britain. Part of the trouble began with the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts this is something I seldom do. Basically, the Navigation Act said that the colonies could only trade on British ships with British crews. In other words, you can only trade with England. They did allow trade with the West Indies because at this time, thanks to Admiral Penn, the English had taken Jamaica from the Spanish. So Jamaica had been discovered by Christopher Columbus and originally was a Spanish colony. But along came the English and they took it, and they were to keep it till they gave them their independence in the 1840s, I believe, or somewhere around there. But anyway, the Navigation Acts prohibited trade with anyone except British ships with British crews. This was like the beginning of the end of the relationship, with good terms between England and the mother country, that is. All right. Now, while this was going on, though, and another thing that influenced England to take more control of the colonies, an Indian named Metacomet, but we call him King Philip, started a war called King Philip's War. Now this was in 1680, and by this time the Indians had the guns. You might say, where did the Indians get their guns? Well, they would trade for them. Also, the French were giving the Indians guns and horses. King Philip's War. King Philip decided that I'm going to convince all the Indians to unite. And we'll get together and we're going to drive all the white men into the ocean. There's only one thing seriously wrong with the plan. It was just too late. If he had done it 20 years earlier, maybe even 10 years earlier, but the European women were having 8 or 10 babies per woman, and more Europeans were coming in from the ocean. In the meantime, from across the sea. In the meantime, the Indian women were still only having about 2 or 3 babies per woman at the most, if even that many. The Indian population was not growing. But King Philip decided he was tired of the white man, and I want to say this, being a white man, the white man was breaking his treaties right and left. The white man promised him, we're not going to go into your territory, and then they would. As their population increased and they had no room, the white man would encroach in his territory, and if that weren't enough, the white man was not keeping his treaty. Morally, the Indians were on the moral high ground. The other side of it was the fighting was suicide. The Indians had no chance at all of winning, but they didn't know that. Anyway, King Philip massacred a few villages on the frontier. The King of England sent over some troops. They joined with the colonials, and they defeated King Philip. This was the last Indian uprising in the New England colonies. But in the meantime, the kings of England decided we have to control these colonials, because these colonials are getting out of hand. They sent an agent at one point to see what was going on in Massachusetts. This agent found all kinds of violations. I mean, I spent 27 years at Lockheed, and every once in a while a government agent would come into Lockheed and find all kinds of violations of our rules and regulations. Just it's the way life is. Well, King James became the second. King James II became king of England. He was Catholic, and he was determined to make both the colonies and England Catholic. Bad move. It was impossible. The people of England sent for his cousin, King William, and William came in with an army. There was no fighting. When King James heard that William had arrived, he left. Now, you understand about, in the case of what happened with King James, there were no radios and televisions. It's like King James received a message, Your Majesty, Prince William of Orange has decided to come over. Within hours, a second messenger, Your Majesty, Prince William has set sail. Within hours, another messenger, you might say, didn't it take, no, the messengers arrived one after another, again, because, the king did not make the trip in a few hours, but the messengers came one after another and told him, Your Majesty, Prince William has landed. The next one came just a short while, Your Majesty, all of England is flocking to Prince William. The King of England fled. When the colonials heard a few months later that the King of England had fled, they rose up and they kicked out all the King's governors, the King James's governors, and they again, made rules that Catholics could not vote and hold office. This is in the books, folks. Now, again, I know some of you might be Catholic, and again, I don't mean in any way to offend you, but this is just simply a historical fact, and I'm teaching you only because it's history. Not that I agree with it, I don't. Nevertheless, this actually happened. Now, but here's another thing that happened. I'm going to digress a little bit. The people of Russia decided they were tired of the czars, so they got rid of the czars and they got Lenin and Stalin. The people of Cuba decided they did not like Batista. They kicked out Batista and they got Castro. You begin to catch what I'm saying, folk. Most revolutions occur this way. You kick out one tyrant and get a worse tyrant in his place. A lot of young men will decide, I don't like my daddy telling me what to do. I don't like my mama telling me to clean up my clothes or to clean out my room. I'm going to go somewhere where I won't be told what to do. I know what to do. I'm going to go join the Marines. This actually happens. I mean, my brother has two brothers-in-law who joined the Marines because they didn't like their father laying down the rules. And once they met those Marine corporals, their father seemed like a nice, easy-going, quiet-mannered man compared to those Marine corporals. And if I'd have been a Marine, I was in the regular Army. And no, I had a friend of mine who left college because he didn't like the dorm supervisor. Served in the Army for 4 years, came back to the same college with the same dorm supervisor. He and that dorm supervisor got along great the next time. Again, that dorm supervisor seemed very mellow compared to the sergeants he encountered. All right. Anyway, King William wound up taking more control over the colonies than King James had, even though King William was not Catholic. The governors were appointed and sent over by the king, and the colonies had to pay them. Had to pay for the governor's wages. The king sent judges, and the colonists had to pay the judges. All right. Now, with this, oh yes, the king enforced a law that you had to be a property owner rather than pay a church member to vote. And therefore, property ownership became the basis for voting throughout the colonies against the colonies' wishes. Now, all this is to wind up leading to war.